Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nikki Jones, professor, and H. Michael and Jeannie Williams, Department Chair of African American Studies at UC Berkeley. I am so pleased to welcome you to our second conversation in our 2021-22 Critical Conversation Series, Skyrise, June Jordan's Architectural Imaginary. Although we meet today in virtual space, we want to begin with a land acknowledgement. The Department of African American Studies recognizes that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community, inclusion, and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. As members of the Berkeley community, it is vitally important that we not only recognize the history of the land on which we stand, but also that Muwekma Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area communities today. And we give credit and thanks to UC Berkeley Centers for Educational Justice and Community Engagement and the Native American Student Development Office for crafting this acknowledgement. Today's conversation, Skyrise, June Jordan's Architectural Imaginary, is, as I said, the second conversation in our year-long celebration of the life and legacy of writer, activist, and longtime UC Berkeley faculty member, June Jordan. Building on our successful Spring 2021 series celebrating Dr. Barbara Christian and exploring the concept of abolition democracy, our Critical Conversation series continues to ask, what are the lessons of the Black feminist, Black radical, and Black intellectual traditions for our moment? And what is the role of Black studies in building more just futures? The Critical Conversation series is supported by the Abolition Democracy Initiative, or the ADI as we call it here on the floor, a 3-year department initiative that began in fall 2020 with the goal of centering and responding to the most pressing questions of the moment, questions that were perhaps new to some, but that we understood as enduring questions about Black freedom and the ongoing project of abolition. With support from the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, the Chancellor and Dean of Social Sciences, and inspired by the work of W.B. Du Bois, Angela Davis, who helped to kick off our series last time, and others writing in the abolitionist tradition, the ADI amplifies the work of academics and activists who are actively imagining and building a world beyond policing and prisons. I want to acknowledge and thank the members of the ADI leadership team, Professors Lee Rayford, Eula Taylor, and Tiana Paschel for the leadership and vision that created the ADI. And thank you as well to Rachel Anspach and Maria Heredia for their invaluable administrative support. Our Critical Conversation series is co-sponsored by the Black Studies Collaboratory, which is led by Professors Lee Rayford and Tiana Paschel. Please see blackstudiescollab.berkeley.edu for more information on this exciting world building program. It'll be dropped in the chat as well. You can also find a full schedule for this year's Critical Conversation series on our department's website, africam.berkeley.edu. That will also be dropped in the chat, where you can sign up for email lists for both the department and the Black Studies Collaboratory. Today's event is being recorded and will be posted along with other conversations in the series on our department's brand new YouTube channel. And a live transcript of this recording is also being generated. So before I turn it over to Professor Rayford, who will moderate today's panel, we'll also introduce our guests for today. I'll end here with just a few thank yous and a final logistical point. First, our deepest thanks to our panelists for today. We appreciate you taking the time to be here, and we are really excited about this conversation. Thank you to our colleagues at ETS for supporting the webinar for today's event. And a big thank you to all of you who are watching this conversation live or who are watching it on a recording for joining us and joining the conversation. And as well, thank you to Michael and Jeannie Williams for your ongoing support of our department. A final logistical note, this will be a conversation as we move to the end of our time today, so please submit questions through the Q&A feature, not the chat window. We can reserve that for troubleshooting and shout outs. And if you do need technical support, please send a message using the chat. So let me turn to introducing our moderator for today's program, Professor Lee Rayford. Professor Rayford is Professor of African American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, where she teaches, researches, curates, and writes about race, gender, justice, and visuality. She is the author of Imprisoned in a Luminous Glare, Photography in the African American Freedom Struggle, co-editor with Heike Rafael Hernandez of Migrating the Black Body, Visual Culture in the African Diaspora, and co-editor with Renee Romano of the Civil Rights Movement and American Memory. Professor Rayford is inaugural director and co-PI with Tiana Paschel of the Black Studies Collaboratory, a 3-year initiative to amplify the world-building work of Black Studies, which is funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. As I've said more than once, Professor Rayford is a brilliant scholar and an endlessly generous colleague who continues to build upon, strengthen, and push forward the Black feminist foundations of our department, the foundation laid by people like Barbara Christian and June Jordan. Take it away, Professor Rayford.
Thank you, Nikki. Thanks, Professor Jones, for that wonderful introduction. And especially, I love the idea of shout outs in the chat. Always good to big up each other. So greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the second event in our year-long Critical Conversation series, Catching Up with June, celebrating the life and legacy of June Jordan. Our first event, A Place of Rage, June Jordan and Her Circle, featured a conversation between Angela Davis, Pratibha Parmar, and myself. And like Nikki said, the recording is available on the Department of African American Studies website. You can also still view the film, A Place of Rage, for free. It's being streamed at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive website until October 10th. This year's Critical Conversation celebrates the life and legacy of June Jordan, born 1936 in Harlem, New York, and joined the Ancestors in 2002 in Berkeley, California. Jordan was a gifted and prolific writer who authored more than 28 volumes of poems, essays, libretti, art catalogs, and works for children. Jordan was a powerful activist who, in her breadth of commitments, asserted that freedom cannot be qualified, as she called us in to stand together against all manner of terror and injustice. She was an innovative teacher, always attuned to the whole being of her students, and from 1988 to her passing in 2002, June Jordan was a member of the African American Studies Department here at UC Berkeley, where she created the long-running Poetry for the People program. This series is both a celebration of June Jordan and an opportunity for those of us who arrived in the department after June's passing to learn together with all of you the depth of her radical commitments, the incisiveness of her pen, and the expansiveness of her vision for liberation. Last year's series, as Dr. Jones mentioned, celebrated the life and legacy of Dr. Barbara T. Christian, and you can find that entire series on our department website. For us, these critical conversations have been at once grounding and generative, a reminder of the Black feminist foundations of our work here, and an opportunity to renew our commitment to Black studies as life studies, as June Jordan wrote in her 1969 essay, Black Studies, Bringing Back the Person. In the course of our last event, Angela Davis asserted how the world is just now, quote, catching up with June, her politics, her poetics, her practice for living. And we've decided that that is the perfect title for this series. One area where June Jordan was way ahead of her time was in her attention to architecture as a site for Black world building and freedom dreaming. Her interest in architecture, what June herself called an obsession, began in the early 1960s as a research interest. That interest would manifest as the full-blown design proposal Skyrise for Harlem in the wake of the police murder of 15-year-old James Powell in July 1964, the ensuing protests, and the police retaliation, which the police would then name the Harlem Riot. Jordan found herself filled with a rage that was hardening into an irreversible and impotent hate. Jordan, though, resolved not to run in hatred, but had to ask herself, what was I for? And indeed, that question prompted her to turn to architecture, because architecture was, in her words, a way, a scale of looking at things that escaped the sundering paralysis of conflict by concentrating on the point, the purpose of the fight. What kind of schools, and what kind of streets, and what kind of parks, and what kind of privacy, and what kind of beauty, and what kind of music, and what kind of options would make love a reasonable, easy response. Jordan reached out to futurist architect F. Buckminster Fuller, proposing a collaborative architectural redesign of Harlem that would come to be called Skyrise for Harlem. Skyrise re-envisioned a vibrant and just Harlem that provided beautiful and low-cost housing, green spaces with access to the shorelines, and the elimination of parallel straight lines that replicate so-called what Jordan called patterns of inevitability. Jordan and Fuller paid close attention to every detail, imagining skyrise as a form of federal reparations to the ravaged people of Harlem. In Jordan's words, a Pacific, life-expanding design for a human community. And for Jordan and Fuller, that was close at hand. It was not merely necessary, it was possible. In an early letter to Fuller as they began their collaboration, Jordan closed with an exhortation for what was most urgent to her. Quote, "I would wish us to indicate the determining relationship between architectonic reality and physical well-being. I hope that we may implicitly instruct the reader in the comprehensive impact of every where, of any place. This requires development of an idea or theory of place in terms of human being, a space designed as volumetric expression of successful existence between earth and sky, of space cherishing as it amplifies the experience of being alive, the capability of endless beginnings and the entrusted liberty of motion, of particular space inexorably connected to multiple spatialities, a particular space that is open, receptive and communicant, yet sheltering particular life." When Esquire magazine published Skyrise for Harlem, they wrote Jordan out entirely and listed Fuller as the sole author of what the editors now called a utopian plan. Esquire renamed the piece Instant Slum Clearance. So Skyrise asks us and invites us to think about many things. What is the role of architecture in and as Black world building and freedom dreaming? It asks us to think about the historical erasure of Black architects and their design work, and more broadly, Black architectural and spatial thinking. It asks us what constitutes Black spaces. It asks us, is imagining just Black life only legible as utopian? It asks us, what is the time of Black justice? And it invites us to think about the beauty and challenges of collaboration. To help us explore these questions in Skyrise in more depth, we are joined today by three brilliant, innovative, imaginative thinkers and practitioners of Black placemaking. And indeed, they have been really fundamental to my own thinking with June Jordan. Cultural historian, architectural designer, and curator Mabel O. Wilson teaches architecture and Black studies at Columbia University, where she also serves as the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies. She's the author of Begin with the Past, Building the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and Negro Building, Black Americans in the World of Fairs and Museums. With her practice studio, Mabel Wilson was a member of the design team that recently completed the memorial to enslaved laborers at the University of Virginia. Mabel Wilson, together with Sean Anderson, organized the historic and stunning group show Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City earlier this year. Olalekan Jayefis Lake was one of 10 artists featured in the Reconstruction show and is a member of the Black Reconstruction Collective, which is a nonprofit organization founded by the participating artists of the show. Lake is a Brooklyn-based artist whose artwork examines the relationship between architecture, community, and the environment. He's exhibited widely and has spent over a decade creating large-scale installations for a variety of public spaces. He's also received numerous grants and residencies and is a recipient of a 2021 fellowship by the United States Artists. Lake and Brandy T. Summers are currently collaborating on the Apocryphal Gospel of Oakland, an absurdist critique of absurd government policy confronting the housing crisis in Oakland. And so our last, and certainly not least, panelist is my colleague, Brandy T. Summers, who's an assistant professor of geography and global metropolitan studies here at UC Berkeley, and is co-founder and co-director of the Berkeley Lab for Speculative Urbanisms at UC Berkeley. Her book, Black in Place, The Spatial Aesthetics of Race in a Post-Chocolate City, explores how aesthetics and race converge to map Blackness, and the way that competing notions of Blackness structure economic relations and develop land in the gentrifying city. I am especially indebted to Brandy for helping me conceive and structure today's event, and I am grateful to each of our panelists for joining us today. So if you will go ahead and unmute yourselves and join me in our panel. We're going to begin by, I've asked each of the panelists to reflect briefly on Skyrise for Harlem and how you came to know Ju Jordan and her work, and how Skyrise has impacted your own practice. And they're going to tell us a little bit about their work. We'll have conversation after that, and about 1:15 or so, we'll open things up for Q&A. So please do put your questions use the Q&A function. And yeah, please shout each other out in the chat. Thank you all three for joining us today. And we're going to start with Mabel Wilson.
Right. Thank you, Lee, for that lovely introduction. And I'm very excited to be here. Thanks, Nikki. I mean, what really great work you guys are doing. And just thank you, everyone, for, sort of putting today's event together. I'm just going to talk briefly, and I'm going to maybe give a little backstory about how Jordan was important to why Jordan is important to how the Reconstruction show was put together and conceptualized. And it's really from my more scholarly work. So I'm just going to share an excerpt from an essay that was published in a really fantastic book called Among Others, edited by Charlotte Barat and Darby English, and published. The subtitle is Blackness at MoMA. Okay, so let me share screen. Okay, and is that okay? Everybody can see, everybody can hear. Okay, so how can we make sense of the absence of Black designers in the first and still one of the most significant collections of modern architecture and design in the world, one that shaped the historiography of modernism and incorporated into its tenets into education, practice, and manufacturing? Out of the 12,000 objects and artifacts acquired in the 84 years since its founding in 1932, the Museum of Modern Art's Department of Architecture and Design had accessioned into its permanent collection no works by a Black architect or designer until 2016, when the museum acquired Charles Harrison's Viewmaster Model G, a popular mass-produced plastic shell stereoscope designed in 1962. And I'm showing here actually a view of a designer named Joel Robinson. He was trained as an architect, but as this article reveals in Ebony, could not find work in the lily white field of architecture. And so he kind of became a designer of all trades. He did furniture design, he did graphic design, and he also did a series of fabric designs. And these designs were actually shown in an exhibition in the Museum of Modern Art in the 1950s. And so Ebony and Jet Magazine, Johnson Publishing, published these articles about his work. His was only the one of two artifacts that we could find in what's called the study collection, which is not the main collection of the museum. And so that's where these swatches are. They're now in the main collection, as are works by artist Amanda Williams as well. But anyway, it raised a lot of questions about the whiteness of that archive, and in particular, how whiteness underwrites both architecture and its history. So as anthropologist Michelle Roth-Trio wrote in Silencing the Past, quote, "The making of archives involves a number of selective questions: selection of producers, selection of evidence, selection of themes, selection of procedures, which means at best the differential ranking, and at worst the exclusion of some producers, some evidence, some themes, and some procedures. Power enters here both obviously and surreptitiously," end quote. So what then is architecture's power? particularly of racialization within the institution of MoMA and beyond the archive's walls. Now, the invisibility of Black designers in MoMA's exhibitions, and most conspicuously in its A&D collection, highlights the paradox of modern architecture and design in terms of its ideal universality, like it's an architecture for everyone in the modern world, its goal of service to all, in contrast to those that it actually served. MoMA's experiments in private and public housing reveal the intimacies of spaces designed for individuals, families, and communities. It is precisely in these everyday realms of home, of work, and of public space that anti-Black racism walled off white bodies from their racial others. The places many Americans called home were regulated by racial boundaries that segregated white residents from Black ones. And many white-owned houses, however, were transgressed daily by Black domestics, often the labor force that maintained the impeccable order and polished gleam of the modern interior. So Philip C. Johnson was an architect, an advocate of modernism in architecture design. He was the founder and head curator of the A&D department, but he was also a public booster and organizer of the American Nazi Party in the 1930s. So let's take a look at a magazine photograph of Philip Johnson's iconic Connecticut residence, the Glass House. Built in 1945, one photo shows Johnson sitting at his desk, while another photo captures a Black butler behind the kitchen counter. Architect and architectural theorist Mario Gooden observes of this photograph, quote, Johnson said that he wanted to keep the kitchen very abstract, to make it a simple bar. It seems that this figure of the Black butler standing at the cooking unit signified that this was the service space of the house. And it's important because it signifies the larger ways race has been at the service of modern architecture, end quote. The French architect Le Corbusier, too, saw Blackness in that of service. Visiting Harlem during a trip in the United States in 1935, in part sponsored by MoMA, the Frenchman rhapsodized about hot jazz and the dynamic movement of Black performers, including trumpeter Louis Armstrong, as akin to machines and Black skyscrapers. This raw, primitive energy of modernity would give rise to white cathedrals, modern skyscrapers in Le Corbusier's beloved Europe. Whether discovered in the ghetto, the colony, or remote regions, Blackness and Black building forms in their vital simplicity provided white architects with conceptual and formal inspiration to advance their cause of social progress and technological development in the metropole. In this period, was there a critical Black architecture or not in service of white modernism? So in April of 1965, Esquire published an article by Black architect and writer June Jordan, writing under the nom de plume June Meyer. And as Lee pointed out, it appeared under the title Instant Slum Clearance, which featured the proposal Skyrise to Harlem, which was the original title of the essay, before Esquire placed it with something more provocative and attributed the project solely to Jordan's white collaborator, Buckminster Fuller. Working with Fuller, whose work had been featured in solo shows at MoMA, Jordan envisioned a new architectural landscape for Horizon, absent the devastating sweep of slum clearance. Launched as a critique of urban renewal's ruthless displacement of poor residents, Skyrise to Harlem imagined a participatory process in which Harlem's Black residents would incrementally build skyward a new community of 100 circular decks with residents adorned by hanging gardens fed by recycled water. I mean, it was amazing ecological thinking in this work. To avoid the displacement typical of urban renewal, the first floor of the new structure would align with the seventh top floor of many of the old buildings. Jordan wrote in a letter to Fuller that once the new structures were completed, Harlemites would literally, quote, move into their new homes, the enormous ground area freed to be converted to communal open space for recreation, parking, and so forth, end quote. A truly modern proposition, Skyrise to Harlem sought to harness the power of industrialized housing production while remaining attentive to social and natural ecologies. Jordan and Fuller suggested that private investment would be generative for the 100,000 families who would dwell in its filigree structures. Their eco-towers each populated with shared amenities and social services, which sprout from the bottom up and be built by the Black community, preserving social relations in Black social spaces while opening the area to settlement by other non-Black residents. In contrast to white architects who, for MoMA's New City show, which was shown a year later, imagined dropping gridded mega structures into the neighborhood from above. And while one can find various works of Fuller in MoMA's collection and archives, the Black architecture of Skyrise to Harlem is not included. The ability to survey and control what's inside the private domain of the self and what's outside the public sphere of politics provides white architecture and its archive with stability. It is precisely the way that buildings separate Black and other bodies from white ones that produces the onto-epistemological experience of racial differences. Modern architecture builds the world for the white subject, maintaining the logics of racism while also imagining a future world where non-white subjects remain exploitable and marginal. The power of architecture in its archive is to produce whiteness by design. Now, one response to this silencing of the archive was the exhibition Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America that I co-curated with Sean Anderson and Ariel Dion-Krosnick. What Reconstruction exposed was the devastating anti-Black racism while simultaneously imagining spaces of Black sociology and liberation. And I would just add as a conclusion that June Jordan's Skyrise to Harlem really served as a critical resource for how a Black world can be imagined and how the Afro-imaginary can make that possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mabel. And I just want to note there are some questions that are coming up in the Q&A that we will get to later on in our conversation. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lake.
Thank you, Mabel, for that incredible presentation, Lee. And, I'm really excited to be here and be on this panel. I can't quite remember when I was introduced to June Jordan and her writings and her work and her biography and such. I feel like I've sort of been kind of introduced and reintroduced over the years, but I would say, I think from the outset, what I found like really intriguing and incredibly inspiring, particularly for my own practice, was just her curiosity around the sort of radical potential for architecture, architectural fictions, the sort of speculative architectural narratives to really explore, possibilities for a just, equitable community, for places like Harlem and Brooklyn, and kind of, just thinking particularly within the field of architecture, which is kind of a very fundamentally, exclusionary space. So much so, for Black women now, and almost completely prohibitive during June Jordan's time. And so just for me, being really inspired by, like, again, her curiosity and interest in, like, the fact that she initiated this collaboration, with Buckminster Fuller, who is this, kind of visionary architect, and really bringing in her ideals, her, sort of developing eco-social concepts, her interest in sort of community driven environmental design, the idea of extending agency to the communities being engaged with, and also, having that kind of be in collaboration with Buckminster Fuller, again, someone who's probably a sort of founder of solar punk in a sense, one of the early founders of solar punk. And solar punk is effectively this subgenre of science fiction that really examines the inextricable connectivity between architecture, environment, community, technology, the idea that these are really holistic endeavors, right, that are deeply connected. And so, for me, that's incredibly inspiring, that sense of collaboration. As Lee mentioned, I'll be discussing a collaboration that I'm currently working on with Dr. Brandy Summers, in addition to my work, which also falls very much within the realm of solar punk and of architecture as a kind of medium of exploring environmental justice. So I'm going to share screen to briefly discuss two projects that I think are really within, um, you know, sort of in accordance with the spirit of, June Jordan's, again, eco-social ideology around architecture's potential in collaboration with Buckminster Fuller. And the first project is actually from Brandy and I's The Apocryphal Gospel of Oakland, which, as Lee mentioned, examines really, the absurd policy prescriptions presented to ostensibly address the issue of homelessness in the Bay, but really creates this kind of feedback loop of these very temporary, kind of ridiculous suggestions, right? But one of the projects, one of the scenarios, we have several that Brandy's going to go through, but one of the scenarios is called the Acorn Collective, and it kind of pivots away from the absurd policy prescription, and instead sort of becomes in a sense a reclamation, and a refuge for a Black community in response to the aggressive gentrification of the Lake Merritt uh, area of Oakland, but also, as many of you will be familiar with, the absurd policing of Black people in what were once really predominant Black spaces. And so uh, the most notorious, of course, is Barbecue Becky, who you will remember was calling the police on a Black family because she was incensed by the fact that they were using a charcoal grill, and apparently that is not allowed or a safety hazard or something. And then Jogger Joe, who was, taking the belongings of an unhoused person and just throwing them, around the park or what have you. So really, we came up with the idea of Acorn Collective, and it's kind of a nod to what was a proposal that kind of never went through, but it was for reverse integration, and kind of reclaiming the name of that development, Acorn, and calling it the Acorn Collective, and instead really developing this ecologically conscious, low impact, almost kind of elaborate, community that uses natural materials, locally sourced materials. You're looking at this system of thatched walkways, cantilevered public and private spaces, and just the idea of this utopic ideal, in a sense, coming out of these sort of repressive practices to sort of return Lake Merritt to its Black community, and return to the idea that so many Black Oaklanders would go to Lake Merritt on Sunday, right? And so this is really considering that idea of reclamation, and also somewhat in the tradition and legacy of maroon communities as well. And so this is sort of one such vision that I feel is very much, again, connected to that collaboration that June Jordan had with Buckminster Fuller. The next project I want to show is called The Frozen Neighborhoods. And so The Frozen Neighborhoods was my installation that was in the MoMA exhibit, reconstructions, of course, as Mabel mentioned, incredibly curated by Mabel, Ariel, and Sean. And what this project did was really to look at severely restrictive government policies that are put forth to address a global climate crisis, but as would happen, impacts, marginalized communities far more than others. So similarly to the Acorn Collective, kind of reimagining, thinking through, these very oppressive systemic parameters, but then imagining a kind of utopian ideal emerging. So I wanted to look at that through Brooklyn, through my neighborhood that I've lived in Brooklyn for over 20 years now, Crown Heights, and just, remake Crown Heights in this, really eco-futurist, Afro-surrealist vision. These are actually, I don't have the before photographs, but these are actually pictures from right around my neighborhood, only a few blocks away. The one on the right is a Crown Pro wetland intersection. So, transforming these major arteries and thoroughfares in Brooklyn into this, freshwater marsh. And again, thinking through so many things like Black folks' relationship to water, whether in a sense of leisure or in a sense of baptism and in sense of access, right? Really reclaiming all of these things. On the right is Plant Seeds, Grow Blessings, the Brooklyn Interfaith Seed Vault. So I'm transforming these kind of warehouses in my neighborhood into a kind of seed vault. So again, really that tradition of community driven design, sustainable practices, really idea of environmental justice. Another aspect to this is reclaiming the MTA. So the MTA is the Metropolitan Transit Authority, the subway system of New York. Since its inception, it has been going through renovation after renovation, increased fare hikes without really resolving its infrastructural issues, and also, the surveillance and the policing of Black people. So in this world, a group of young Black coders called the TFN, the Frozen Neighborhood Clerisy, they have actually co-opted, the MTA, renamed it the Main Threshold Access, transformed it into this massive proprietary virtual neural gateway that, though this community is kind of closed off, this is just one of the incredible kind of developments that the community is putting forth, and really reclaiming this institution, the subway institution, as a space of access and of learning and of providing social services. And finally, I just want to play a video of this world. I'm calling it kind of the morning anthem. So this is effectively just this architectural fly through of the frozen neighborhoods world. It gives you an overview of really what this community is about. Thank you. That is my time.
Thank you, Lake. That was beautiful. And with that, I'm going to hand it to Brandy.
Thanks so much, Lee. Thank you, Nikki, as well. And I really appreciate my panelists. It's kind of liberating and also scary to go last after you both, but I really appreciated your presentations. And I'm actually going to go back to the project that Lake mentioned, which is the Apocryphal Gospel of Oakland. But first, I do want to talk a little bit about June Jordan. And Lee, thank you for the questions that you introduced and also the reading that you provided to have us think more about Jordan. And also, I want to acknowledge the person who was the subject of last semester's series, Barbara Christian, another really important figure and former professor at UC Berkeley. So first, I just want to say I too don't remember when I came across June Jordan's work. It was her written work first. I didn't come across Skyrise for Harlem until maybe a few years ago. And at that time, I didn't realize that she really had this robust architectural imagination. But it was from viewing Skyrise that basically I gave up any type of attempts to understand poetry. I am not really great at understanding poetry, and instead focused on this visual imagination that she was crafting for us. And so, you know, as Lee mentioned, her this collaborative project, and these designs came from her love of people, specifically love of Black people, and this resistance to really focus on the hatred that she had for whiteness. She believed herself, as Lee mentioned, and also Lake and Mabel, to be doing the work of environmental design. And so in many ways, she was thinking about this architectural redesign of Harlem in a way that incorporated adaptability, but also materiality. So, you know, what I feel like she was doing in her architectural imagination was challenging how we approach questions of Blackness and Black life, which is something really central to my own work. But just specifically as it relates to Skyrise for Harlem, there was this process, as you saw in the images, of building up instead of eradicating structures and clearing spaces, right? And so this was part of what Buckminster Fuller had proposed as part of this kind of four-dimensional idea. So at 4D instead of 3D, where the fourth dimension was time. And so in many ways, though Fuller was saying that, you know, structures were both, or buildings were both temporal and spatial in how we think about them, it was Jordan who was really bringing that idea to life. And so, speaking as a geographer who's trained in sociology and also in history, thinking about this co-constitution of time and space is something that's been crucial specifically to human geography. So, you know, in the 1980s, Edward Soja started critiquing Marxist geography's focus on the social over the spatial. And so he was saying that there should be this focus instead on sociospatial, right? That geography shapes class just as much as class shapes geography. But in this way, there's also, or a better way of saying it is, there's this sociospatial dialectic through which spatial and social forms, relations and processes end up, again, being mutually constituted. Later on, he started thinking about this similarly in terms of time and space, right? And so that's privileging the socio or spatio-temporal instead. And so from these arguments, he talked about third space. I don't want to get into that, but essentially he was drawing on or speaking to a bunch of white male critics in this way of thinking about space and time together. So I'm bringing this up because I think it's important as we're talking about Jordan that we acknowledge the ways that people outside of designated fields of expertise, right, are enacting the work that's often celebrated for being imagined by white men. So with the work that Jordan was doing, she was imagining this before the conversations were being had later, specifically in the field of geography. And so this vision of Skyrise for Harlem directly connects to these really valuable or invaluable principles that guide much of what we're still reading about today in fields like geography, history, sociology, architecture, and planning, right? So she's addressing these epistemological questions that are inherent to design and writings, mostly how and what, do we come to know about Black living and Black life? Jordan was really taking apart our concept of urban renewal as slum clearance and its devastating impact on Black communities, and instead coming up with ways to actually revitalize these same neighborhoods. So we're thinking about revitalization, presuming that life still exists someplace, whereas urban renewal, thinking about clearance and removal speaks to a different process, a cleansing or this enactment of eminent domain instead. So in a way, and perhaps I'm biased in thinking this because of the project that Lake and I are doing, she's acknowledging really the absurdity of urban renewal and other forms of place annihilation that, conceived by Robert Moses and others. And instead, she's really engaging this inherently palimpsestic, speculative practice. She's proposing that what already exists, we should build upon that, right? And this also really involves her resistance to, or at least resisting a vision of Blackness and Black people as inherently a problem to be cleared or cleaned up. And so on that, I want to introduce the project again that Lake and I are working on, the Apocryphal Gospel of Oakland. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Are we good? Everyone can see that? Hopefully, yes. So Lake introduced it a little bit, but I'm going to go a little bit more into depth about how we were thinking about it, right? So as you see, we're thinking about this apocryphal gospel of Oakland as building on these absurd or fallacious policies and the socio-political fictions that end up underpinning the narrative of homelessness, and particularly this crisis in Oakland and the greater Bay Area. And so I'm thinking about this topic of homelessness and really housing, thinking about the crisis of housing. The Apocrypha of Oakland is that there's housing scarcity, right? Where, there have been findings by the American Community Survey that show that there's 4 vacant units for every unhoused person in the city. And so we see that city leaders frame policy based on this notion of scarcity in order to address rampant homelessness. And then they promote this idea that developing additional housing is the only solution to a crisis that really derives from ongoing structural inequalities. And so what ends up happening is these untenable and even, as we see it, preposterous ideas of transitional housing strategies are presented as viable solutions. And then what ends up happening is there's this erasure of recognizing also the racialized dimensions of homelessness, for which in Oakland, 70% of the unhoused population is Black, but as we just learned with a new census release, that now only 20% of Oakland is Black. So ultimately, this project, what we're trying to do is lampoon policy and power in confronting this crisis. But in doing so, we're envisioning this absurdist sci-fi future that ends up deriving from racist, spurious narratives historically deployed as justifications for Negro removal, but then are more recently explained for the ideas behind housing scarcity in this age of the tech sector boom and our evolving ever-present past. So I'm just going to show you some slides and talk a little bit about it. And so all thanks to Lake, who is a visual art genius, who was able to come up with these images. And as part of the collaboration, we basically went around West Oakland and took a whole bunch of pictures. And he created these gorgeous images. As you see on the left, there's a map in this fictitious but also real place where we've identified these different locations humans were replacing these objects, right? And so again, the focus is on West Oakland, primarily because West Oakland was the central location for Black cultural and economic life. So in 1950, 80% of Oakland's Black population lived in West Oakland, but it was also supported by a robust commercial and entertainment area where most of the Black population was working at nearby shipyards and also as porters. And so we know that West Oakland was irretrievably impacted by urban renewal and other destructive federal policies that ended up breaking up Black neighborhoods and decimating the housing stock. And what I also have to share, and for some of you who know me know, I'm from Oakland. And so it was really the move back to the Bay Area and me witnessing the explosion of the unsheltered, unhoused population that had me contact Lake and ask him if he wanted to do a project together to really think about, again, not so much a way of highlighting tragic porn, right? But instead to think about how we can interrogate the policy while not necessarily fetishizing solutions, but instead really having an opportunity to talk about what exists already. So on the right, you see this huge cruise ship, right? And so this ship is called the Ark. It ends up being this dystopian hybrid. It's a landlocked escape vessel that is poised between an apocalypse in progress and also this post-apocalyptic norm that ends up being replete, as you can see, with signs of entropy, innovation, also resurrection, as well as abjection. And so the Ark is this degraded cruise ship that's propped up on blocks, and you see it's languishing in an empty parking lot in West Oakland. And in the background, you can kind of see it. There's the backdrop of the Interstate 880 federal highway. But also, you know, what's clear about this scene is that it seems like it would be improbable, really, like an allegorical fantasy. But why we came up with it was because in December of 2019, several months before COVID took hold in Oakland specifically, then City Council President Rebecca Kaplan introduced a plan to dock a decommissioned cruise ship at the Port of Oakland, again, adjacent to the West Oakland neighborhood. And the whole idea was to provide emergency shelter for nearly 1,000 unhoused individuals. And so if we think about it, Oakland's port remains one of the busiest in the nation. It's engineered with a federally regulated infrastructure that's designed explicitly for cargo ships, making it structurally untenable for docking cruise liners, right? Even so, Kaplan argued that, you know, having this floating hotel could temporarily address the 86% spike in homelessness that Oakland had witnessed between the years of 2015 and 2019. And so while the floating hotel for unhoused Oaklanders didn't ever become a reality, Kaplan's proposition still became really prescient in the way that on March 9th, 2020, a few months after she proposed this, a ship named the Grand Princess belonging to Princess Cruise Lines docked at the Port of Oakland with more than 2,400 passengers aboard, 21 of whom had tested positive for the coronavirus, right? So the Grand Princess had cut short this cruise to Hawaii and had been stranded in California waters for 10 days with no place to go. Mind you, the idea of this cruise ship, of course, we came up with prior to the Grand Princess docking at the Port of Oakland, but really the idea behind creating or at least highlighting this absurd proposition was more our interest in understanding how we're not kind of dealing with a reality that's thinking about the people who are living there, but instead the reality still becomes part of this insanity. So again, moving pretty quickly, the next image is actually a newer image. So this one is called Tough Towers. So in thinking about the ever-expanding use of parking lots and the reinvention of housing options in Oakland, Tough Towers here folds the future really back into the present day in order to depict a kind of utopianism after the end of utopias, right? So the image, as you see, particularly on the right, shows this elaborate vertical settlement that strains against the edges of an asphalt-covered parking lot on Harrison Street in downtown Oakland. And what I'll tell you is I grabbed my daughter, we got in the car, we went to Harrison and took some images of a parking lot that exists currently. And Lake created these gorgeous, elaborate images. And so Tough Towers is this module, provisional encampment for the unhoused, right? And as we're proposing it, it's administered by the City of Oakland and sponsored by Home Depot, as well as Tough Shed, in partnership with Douglas Parking and Laz Parking. Those are two local companies that operate parking lots in Oakland. So in Tough Towers, in these images, we're visually exacerbating Oakland's multi-million-dollar expansion of community cabins, which are essentially tool sheds that house people beneath freeways, right? And so this community cabins, quote, program is something that we're essentially riffing on, this likelihood of the perpetual existence of temporary housing solutions that use Tough Sheds as a viable residence. So in this image, or both of the images, each of the Tough Towers individual sheds are stacked 10 stories high. The building blocks are intricately configured for structural stability, and their colorful frames are connected by open stairways. You see billboards that are cantilevered off higher units that are advertising informal businesses, and we're saying like, eyebrow threading or vegan tacos. But really, in thinking about what's also on the outside of Tough Shed, or at least the Tough Towers, are these cell phone towers that you can see that grant its inhabitants access to wireless and broadband networks, right? But also we see other forms of technology present. We see the squad of golden drones that are hovering, and they're screening and surveilling guests as well as the residents. And we can easily imagine that they're transmitting evolving demographic data to the Oakland Police Department at the same time. So on the one hand, the Tough Towers represent this top-down system that's imposed on its residents, right? But on the other hand, the marginalized residents of these dystopian towers continue to live with the urban. They're adapting, in our eyes, opportunistically to these political excesses that surround it and manipulate them. And so all of this for us means that the unhoused will further adapt the structure of their settlement and discover new ways to make these uninhabitable spaces habitable. And so it's this way that we're trying to deal with the absurd, but also various forms of innovation. And then finally, we have Upliftment Village. So this one is located at 24th Street on a stretch of road between Peralta and Kirkham Streets in West Oakland. And so you see, the Upliftment Village is nestled between a concrete plant in the background. You see Walker's concrete plant on the left, and a private warehouse. And it's this tidy collection of bike-powered campers that end up being organized to reflect the reconfiguration of public space, specifically in this new era of post-pandemic social distancing. And so the village is sponsored by Bay Wheels, which is a bike sharing venture that comes from Lyft, and ends up being their, again, this is fiction, but the inaugural product of a new shelter sharing system, and in partnership between the tech startup Lyft, as well as the City of Oakland. And so we know Lyft, like Uber, is one of the leaders in the gig economy, one that really ends up favoring flexible sharing of resources and goods through independent contractors and freelancers. In a way, it celebrates self-sufficiency, entrepreneurship, efficient technologies, and really operating at its best. The gig economy can benefit workers and consumers and businesses by making the work more adaptable to meet the needs at the moment. But at the same time, companies like Lyft, like Uber, especially Amazon, they emphasize hard work and perseverance while refusing to classify many of their workers as employees, and at the same time avoiding any responsibility for health coverage, collective bargaining, and other benefits. So you see these various forms of precarious employment via digital platform capitalism that ends up notoriously offering low wages, in addition to a lack of benefits. So in this scene, it's essentially these precarious workers are living in the shelter share spaces that Lyft is producing. And at the same time, they're telling them to cheerfully uplift yourself, right? As if it's not the responsibility of the company itself. So in thinking about these three scenarios, and we have others as part of this series, but thinking about these three scenarios together, upliftment, tough towers, as well as the arc, it's this fantasy that we're essentially drawing on that renders visible kind of what present time platform capitalism actually entails. And so the images really clarify what's going on already, what's going on right now, and also at the same time exposes that which gets hidden under various narratives of personal responsibility, short-term solutionism, et cetera. But also, it's, what we have to recognize ultimately is the way that we acknowledge the longue durée of our ever-present past. And in this way, this is also acknowledging the racialization of space and the ways that we don't identify, in some cases, the Blackness of dispossession in not only American cities, but worldwide, but also drawing on these intricate opportunities that we can to be creative. So thank you. I don't know what kind of time we have, but I'm looking forward to being in conversation. So thanks so much.
That was wonderful. Thank you, the three of you. I'm scribbling furiously, really just struck by, the flow of your presentations, which, Mabel, you started us off thinking, really underscoring the ways in which white supremacy and anti-Blackness are written into our landscapes, and thus the absolute imperative to imagine a different kind of design and spatial arrangements. Like the work in thinking through these kinds of, as you put it, the palimpsestic, speculative practice or eco-social ideologies that you're drawing on from Jordan, and sort of thinking through a kind of community-driven design, really sort of, I think, just like builds on Skyrise and sort of gives us these I think for many of us I think in the chat as well, it kind of was so beautiful and really took flight for us. And then Brandy, I think you're just an incisive capture of exactly the kinds of structural policies and built environment that can only imagine Black life as a problem, right? And that sort of underscores exactly where Mabel started us, right? In these questions of erasure and separation, et cetera. And I think I have so many questions. There are a few questions in the chat. And I think I want to ask you to really this question actually about time and space. And I want to come back to sort of what Brandy was thinking through. And really the ways in which, right, Mabel, you're understood as your scholarly work is sort of these histories of race in the built environment, and your concern with cultural memory and memorial. Brandy, you've just given us a really beautiful and sobering ethnography of the present state of this city. And then, like, your work is often understood as Afrofuturist or kind of gesturing towards something in the future. And yet, all of your work reminds us that we are thinking, living, and imagining in real time, in this moment, in a longer kind of in a longer temporality. And so I want to ask you how you think about the kind of, well, really the time of Black space, and how we think about the categories of history, speculative practice, Afrofuturism, memory, memorial. What do these categories give you in terms of thinking about Black space and Black design, and what are the limits for thinking about our moment? And just to sort of clarify, because I know I'm sort of like in a big headspace right now. I'm thinking of the ways that Jordan seemed really frustrated that not only obviously that Skyrise was renamed Instant Slum Clearance, but was called Utopian, right? As if it were a fantasy, as if it were something unattainable and unreachable, when very much the project was about the right now, about the present, and was really devoted to an imaginary that could be enacted. And so I'm thinking about how these questions of sort of future and time and a kind of utopian temporality actually defers the kind of the urgency of and the in some ways the pragmatism, right, of thinking through many of the kinds of real designs of that are supportive of thriving Black life, if that makes sense.
I'll go ahead. So I think that's right, Lee, that there was a presumption that what she proposed wasn't possible, when she really had thought that you build on top of, again, what exists, and then you just start tearing down what's beneath. And so it was this both and strategy where you don't have to clear first and then build, but instead you work with what exists already. And so I think that is important thinking as it relates to time. I know that with the Apocryphal Gospel of Oakland, what I'll say is, we are dealing both in a non-reality and reality. So it's a way that we're imagining what could happen. It's not what is happening, but what could happen. And so lately we've been talking about this folding of time, how for Black people, it's a cycle. And in so many ways, what does it mean to happen over and over and over again? So when she's presuming to break out of this cycle, the presumption is that it's utopian rather than it being a real possibility. And so I think that's what we have to necessarily fight against, but by showing what is holding in place the circle that keeps going around. Time is really important to me in understanding what we presume is possible, but really kind of the ways that the future already is right now. Lake and I have been talking a lot about Scott Miller's work on Afro-surrealism and how the future is already here. Like, we've called it out. It's right now. So if we presume that the future is right now, what can we do instead?
And I would like to add, we've also been having conversations. It's funny when thinking about the sort of things that compelled, June Jordan to consider the Skyrise for Harlem being, these riots or protests or what have you around during the 1964. And we were just talking about this before the panel, how we are literally in a kind of feedback loop. And I think Brandy kind of acknowledged that, because the powers that be are not necessarily interested in resolving these very systemic issues, right? So hence looking at the Apocryphal Gospel of Oakland as these policy prescriptions that are temporary. But for instance, the Tough Tower tiny shed solution has been implemented, in 2012, 2009, 2015. It continues this cycle. But again, speculative architecture now becoming more platformed as a way to examine the possibilities is coming out of the pandemic, is coming out of protest against police brutality, literally the exact same thing that occurred. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the rolling back of voting rights, things that we had, quote unquote, achieved or attained, half a century ago, right? The rolling back of Roe versus Wade. So it's almost like, these things keep getting kind of foregrounded in terms of just sort of like cyclical interest in this particular work, but we still confront, again, that erasure that, even in the best scenario, confront the kind of perception of architectural utopianism, which is just an exercise, right? Which is not necessarily seen as something to be considered or implemented. So, I find myself, I have the label of Afrofuturist, but really I'm working within, atemporal, cotemporalities. I'm working within this kind of cyclical system of history continuing to repeat itself. And I'm imagining alternative timelines, for instance, like the Frozen Neighborhood in my mind takes place in like the mid 90s, right? Because we've been aware of global climate crisis for a very long time, right? So let's pretend policies began to address that. This is what it would look like during the 90s, right? So it's kind of like, coming from within the diaspora and considering these things because of these dystopian things have been enacted on us, particularly here throughout our history, right? It's like we are operating within this cycle that always considers the present, that always considers the past, because those things reverberate right throughout our experiences. And carrying that forward, thinking about near futures or just thinking about the possibility of now.
Mabel, did you want to add anything?
I don't know if you had other questions, or do you want us all?
No, I want to hear from you, and then I'll probably turn to the Q&A because there are no questions populating.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question, and part of what I wanted to try to do, just with what I talked about, was to kind of situate Jordan, kind of think of the context in which she's working, and I just try to remind people that architecture is a tough nut to crack because it's so pervasive. It's everyday, it's mundane, it's utilitarian, and we don't think about it. But architecture is the European art of building. It's not building everywhere. It's a specific set of practices that arises concomitant with colonialism and global expansion. It's, and racial capital. Like it's all, it serves the needs of those projects, right? And it projects the future. It claims the future. Architecture is it's about the project. In a way, and it doesn't do well with its present at all. And I always say, well, don't worry about the present because we're going to make your future better, but it never does, right? But that's how it profits, and that's how it keeps it going. And I think, what Jordan is asking us is to sort of think about the now and how one builds that present in relationship, the future in relationship to that, right? And yet within architecture, that's often not the case. It typically does just go into the future because that's where it can speculate, and literally that's where it can make profit. And so I think, she's asking a lot of really critical questions. And for me, I forgot, I found her work like somewhere in the mid 90s, I think. I'd always been interested because I couldn't find Blackness in my own architectural education and professional experience. I was just reading novels like Toni Morrison and looking at art. Like that's where I was finding like sensibilities of Black space and spatial practices. And, and I just started turning to that because that's what I knew and that's what I was familiar with. And that really gave me a kind of language to start to produce my own work. And that architecture with a capital A was precisely what Black people can't conceptualize. We are not reasonable. We don't have the capacity to make architecture. We can labor to build, but we can't conceptualize as architects. And so, I think Jordan really challenges that and really, begins to kind of offer, I like to say an elsewhere that we can refer to and draw from.
Thank you. I so appreciate that answer because in thinking in reconstructions in the opening where you were writing about the space, what Black spaces often are understood as these sort of spaces of racial, dispossession, right? But architecture, we don't make allowances to think about the kitchen, the porch, right? Religious spaces, the spaces of gathering, and I think also think the Maroon community as well, and and I love that all of these projects are taking in and taking in that question of what Black space is and what it could be, not just as a deferred elsewhere, but a right now elsewhere. I'm going to turn to the Q&A. There are a number of questions that have come up, and I think maybe we'll just go sort of go backwards. But Rahawa Haile asked, to what extent do the aesthetics of gentrification, for example, 5/1s in historically Black communities, limit the possibilities of future Black world building and placemaking?
Ooh, so, I think right, I've written a book about this, right? Right. And in a lot of ways, I was thinking a lot about critiquing urban planning and architecture for their lack of recognition that Blackness is really driving a lot of why they do what they do, despite any kind of escapism, thinking that they're providing for the people generally. And so these particular aesthetics of gentrification, and I know there's been a lot of discourse about 5/1s and other ugly building projects, or this way to create multi-use space where you can live on top of a place where you can shop, et it still creates these dimensions of class and racial barriers where people actually can't come together in the ways that not only the state but developers are trying to say matters. So the aesthetics of gentrification specifically throw a wrench in this idea of Black world making and placemaking traditionally, in the sense that they focus on diversity. They say that if you just get diversity together, if you bring about, different colored bodies and bring them together, then we've solved the problem of racism. We've solved these problems of oppression. When hopefully all of us in this room together know that that's not true. And so there has to be this focus on the ways that racial capitalism particularly is pervasive in all of these areas that absolutely attempt to extinguish Black life and livelihood. And so from that standpoint, that doesn't mean that we can't make places, that we can't build a world. We're constantly building worlds. We are the most resilient people on the planet. So it's not so much that that Black world making and placemaking ends up being squashed. It's just the terms under which it's happening need to be rethought. And so that's why, there's something that Lake actually has talked about in terms of not wanting to solve the problems that we didn't create, right? Why can't we imagine the things that are mundane? Why can't we just kind of ruminate on the porch? Why can't we think about sitting on porches with aunties and having conversations that make us happy or just make us feel like we're here? And so I think Black world making looks different than this exchange of capital or this way that we have to make a profit. Instead, Black world making is happening all the time. It is incredibly mundane and beautiful. So the aesthetics of gentrification don't close that out, don't close out that possibility. It's really the lens by which we're looking or through which we're looking that's going to establish the potential for it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to agree with that. And like, we'll remember, like, one of the things you make clear about Reconstructions is we're not here to solve your problem. Even though one of the critics were like, I want pragmatic solutions. I'm like, I'm not solving your oppression of me. Sorry, that's not my job. But I do think that there's a way in which, particularly when you look at redlining, it was exactly managing land valuation, right, to create the D zones. in order so for the A zones to have value, right? You have to create that spatial separation to drive value. So on one hand, you don't want proximity to the Black bodies or blackened bodies, shall we say. But on the other hand, the blackened body is wholly necessary to drive value, right? So you drive the value, you erase the slum neighborhood, right? You clear it, you have policy, money's to be made out of that, right? Then when you starve the public housing that was built because it didn't really have all the resources that were necessary, then you implement gentrification, so it becomes another engine, driving the devaluation of Black bodies, which then drives the valuation of land and the creation of white wealth. And it's just the same game again and again. And at some point, it's just like opt out. It's not about including more people because the system doesn't function that way. That's how value is being generated, both by inclusion in terms of proximity, but exclusion in terms of like where people can live.
I'm sort of torn because we have like 2 minutes left. And I think maybe the place that we can end is just to ask you, sort of taking up this last question, can we meditate longer in the radical possibilities of architecture, its limit, and yet the very real and transformative power of the utopia which Jordan is trying to deliver us to? How do we take her work as an entry point into a conversation that we can then take on and adapt and amplify? And I would ask the same question that I posed to Angela Davis and Pratibha Parmar, which are, put it another way, what are the lessons that Jordan offers you today that you think we need to take on with us?
I find what I love about June Jordan was her Black study and the ways in which, she just worked across what would typically be like disciplines that were separate, and that in order to kind of imagine the world, right, and to make this world exist, she realized that she wasn't going to be like in any kind of pigeonholed into any discipline, and she really was this incredibly creative, spirited maker through many different kind of languages, whether it was the language of drawing or the language of words. And I think it's a really, really good model, especially as we, inhabit institutions that keep us in our silos. And I think that, that Black studies often is, in order to do the work, requires something so much more multivalent, in order for these Black worlds to be engaged and made.
I think that's a really hard question, Lee, and thank you for that answer, Mabel, because I think the inherent interdisciplinary, multi-methodologically sound way that she comes to us is what's so important. And there's a way that reading and viewing her ideas tell us that we have to demystify the concept of an expert, or demystify this idea that someone knows better than you and where you live. And so I think those kinds of ideas are often taken for granted, and especially in fields and especially with practitioners who are tasked with making a place habitable for other people. And so it's clear that her experiences drove her ideas and were really smart, futuristic, but not utopian in the sense that they could happen, right? They should happen in so many ways. And even if it isn't the actual material, at least the ideas can inform how we approach, ways that we collect knowledge, ways that we see things. I think June Jordan helps us see differently. And that's something that we often also take for granted, whether it's through, the photographer's eye. Oftentimes, again, with poetry, I still struggle with it, but understanding these ways that someone who is really this speculative architect can help us see and envision a Black world differently. That's what we have to take with us. She told us how to do it. It's just we have to keep doing it over and over. over again. So I really hold that dear to me, and I try to do that in my work.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add to what Brandy and Mabel said, 'cause I think they really captured it perfectly. And again, back to, my initial comment about what really drew me to June Jordan was simply her decision to pursue this particular language, right? Both in written text and in, the architectural form and the architectural conventions, while not being a capital A architect, while not finishing school, while, having this kind of confidence to initiate these collaborations. The architectural field, particularly architectural education, has always been so incredibly insular, even within, your own sort of like institutions, right? So that for even this, conversation we're having here, for me, is something that I don't see happen a lot, right? In order to particularly gain, sort of new, I mean, like these very unique, but incredibly like valuable perspectives. Again, and the idea of collaboration being incredibly important. For me, that is the most, I would say, like enriching aspect of my practice, is to filter, my own creative process, my own way of conceptualizing ideas through, for instance, my conversations with Brandy and her work, right? And the fact that June Jordan was unafraid to do that. And from what I've read, I'm by no means an expert on her work, but once she had decided to pursue that instead of the idea of being paralyzed by frustration and hatred, it wasn't like she was dismayed that this project isn't being implemented. Right? Again, we need to keep doing it over and over and over again. Again, because one of the things I noticed is just in so many of these Q&As is, again, the desire to, how do we take this and implement it right now, right? You know what I mean? And that is a much, much more complicated, again, question, because we're confronted with, this institution that is self-perpetuating, right? But not only that, the perception of what architecture is and the value, as Mabel was saying, this is the way this institution operates. This definition that we've come to understand, all of us, is a very specific Western definition that is not about the solutions of the present day right now. It's about an imperial legacy that will go forth. It is about clearing land. And, not to be discursive, but I just read an article about how indigenous communities have been planting in the forest for thousands and thousands of years, and anthropologists and ecologists didn't, believe that like that was what like evince an agrarian, a agrarian society, right? An advanced society. But these communities had been kind of doing very specific, ecological planting and biodiversity within these forests, and that, anthropologists were unable to recognize that as a kind of advancement, right? But these forest gardens and farms have persisted, right? Even now, thousands and thousands of years later. And something like that fundamentally challenges the sort of perspective of Western architecture, which is, again, an imperial colonial agenda, and about permanency, about lasting as long, and about dominion over the natural environment, regardless of its detriment to that natural environment. And we're taught that in our schools. So these kind of conversations, which completely, deconstruct these very fundamental perceptions of what this field is, what success is, what is valuable, whether it's a built work or not built work, and how that value translates and contributes to whatever ideals we want to see, for our communities.
Well, we are at time, we're after time, but it's time. Thank you, Brandy, Mabel, Lake, for your really your brilliance and just the way you have really tapped into June Jordan's capacity to dream, her invitation for us to dream and think differently about our world and our space. I want to invite everyone who's here, all of the participants, to join us on November 15th for our third Critical Conversations event on Black girlhood that will be moderated by my colleague Nikki Jones, and will feature Kat Brooks, Kenley Brown, and Holly Joshi. I want to also let folks know if we didn't get to your questions, we're saving the Q&A, and I'm hoping that we can have those questions, we can get to some of those either through YouTube. And I just want to thank, again, our panelists for an absolutely beautiful conversation. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.